Bethlehem College and Seminary is still accepting applications for the coming academic year. For more information, visit bcsmn.edu.
One thing I want to say right before I begin this presentation is that this subject we are looking at today is a touchy subject. It's a sensitive subject. It's a subject that affects many people's lives. There may be people in this room whose lives are affected by it. And so I want to make sure that we approach it with the utmost serious, not seeking to ridicule or dismiss what may be in fact be affecting someone's life today. So I want to take this with the utmost serious, and I would ask that you would all do the same along with me. I want to make sure we understand what we are saying and what the various philosophers we're going to interact with say. Also along those lines, at the end, when we do the question and answers, please be respectful in the way that the questions are asked. All right? Okay. Freddie Mercury, in a song called Innuendo, sings I'm not going to sing them for you. I'm sorry. But sings the following words. You can be anything you want to be. Just turn yourself into anything you think that you could ever be. I'm going to tell a little story before we get into this. It's a stereotypical story. I do have people in mind who I know who are living this story, but I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. This could be anybody. It could be nobody. Parents, maybe growing up in the 70s or 80s, they grew up in the church. They head off to college. Maybe they study theology. Maybe they study scriptures, whatever they study. They are Christians. They attend church regularly. They get married out of Bible college or out of college during college, whatever. They start having kids. Now, having kids is kind of fun when they're young. And then they start learning they can rebel against parents, right? You know, they start learning they have a voice. And all of a sudden, parents are kind of like, okay, this thing was cute. What do I do with this thing that's no longer cute? Or, I mean, still cute, but man, how could a thing that's so cute stand up against me, right? Like, it's holding ground. And so they have children, and they're raising children as best they can, seeking to raise them in the Word, taking them to church, seeking to raise them in the church. And then one day, sometime in their teenage years, one of those children that they love deeply, that they have raised, that they have poured their life, heart, time, energy, money, everything into, tells them, I know you guys called me John. I think my name is Jane. Now, if those parents were in fact born in the 70s or 80s, this would mean that their children are living in the 2000s. Those parents probably did not grow up studying transgender theory. They're most likely not critical theorists and may not have any knowledge of any of those themes. They may not even have heard of those terms when their child tells them this. So what do? I mean, they go to the pastor. Surely the pastor will know what to do. Not usually. I hate to say it. I have pastored in Quebec, and I would tell you, if someone had come to me with this, I think I would have fallen on my back, like in the timeline that I'm thinking of. And I would have been very much uncertain about how to proceed. However, there's something that creates. Because those parents go see their parents, so the parents go see the pastors, but what are they going to do now that their child wants to start acting like a female, having been born a male? The parents may deal with shame. They may be questioning their own parenting practices, like, what did we do? We thought that we were raising them in the Lord. You know, we were bringing them to church every day. Where did we screw up? They keep going to church, but not knowing how to interact with their child and not knowing how to explain it to other people in the church, they end up feeling, the parents, quite alone as the child himself probably feels. They do what any parent does that's not an expert in transgender theory, that doesn't know anything. They try to say, I love you, and we will support you, and we don't know what you're going through, but we love you. And then what happens is that some probably well-meaning people in the church start blaming the parents for the children's actions, start ridiculing that child, pointing the finger and laughing, arguing against them, maybe on social media, maybe right in their face, like, where did you screw up? And what does that do? Not only does the child become pushed away and pushed out of the society that he grew up in with the friends and family, the parents do as well. And so the parents leave the church. That is a stereotypical situation that can happen in our churches today. And I say that is because I know people who have been in that situation, and in fact are in that situation. They are suffering. And so we need to take this question very seriously. What is a human? For some people, it's kind of obvious. For many people, it isn't. And philosophy, over the past 100 years, has been working very hard to make it very difficult to tell us what it means to be a human. Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher, suggests in his Existentialism is a Humanism, a very short book, you can read it probably in a day. He says, man is free and there is no human nature upon which I can be grounded. He's not going out on his own. He's not the first person to propose such a theory. He's actually following in the footsteps of those who came before him. He, in fact, sees himself as interpreting and applying Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher of the same time period. Sartre denies that there is any such thing as a human nature. Man's freedom consists not just in what he can choose, not just in that he can choose this or that way of life. Man's freedom consists in the fact that he is the ground of his own being. But when he says being, he doesn't mean existence, he means essence. He means what I might want to call essence or nature, what you are. I am the ground of my own what I am. He says in his own words, the existentialist thinks, therefore, that man, with no support and nothing to rescue him, is condemned at each moment to invent man. Simone de Beauvoir, who was Sartre's muse, which is the nicest way of putting it, following in Sartre's footsteps, famously wrote in her book, The Second Sex, that a person is not born but becomes a woman. You are not born, but you become a woman. And now, there's one sense in which you might agree with that, right? You might say that the boy becomes a man, the girl becomes a woman, but this is certainly not what Simone de Beauvoir is arguing. She is following in the footsteps of Sartre. You're not born, you might change that just slightly. You're not born feminine, you become feminine. Judith Kaufman, in her article on Beauvoir and Kinsey, talking about sexuality in the midst of the 20th century, Judith Kaufman suggests that for Beauvoir, there was no point in bracketing the humanity of humans. The human being is a historical idea, not a natural species. To be human was to develop all of one's possibilities, to open or to project towards the future, to be self-creating, to seek to be able to transform oneself and one's world. How, in her situation, a woman would become human, navigating the maze of external and internal obstacles. This was the core of Beauvoir's study. Her book, The Second Sex, was how do you become a woman? You create yourself somehow. That's what it means to become a woman. Note the idea that human being is a historical idea. So if you want to know how we use the word human and human being today, you have to study history. But it's not an idea that has to do with any particular nature or essence. It's a historical idea. So one becomes a woman, not by maturing, but to use the terms that Beauvoir would use, to project oneself into their own possibilities in a womanly manner. To become what a woman would be. Judith Butler, I brought 2 of her books. She has written a lot of books and a lot of articles. I personally would place her as one of the most important transgender theorists alive today. Judith Butler follows in the footsteps of Michel Foucault, Simone de Beauvoir, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and many other French feminists. And she suggests, however, that they have not quite gone far enough in their arguments. Now, you're maybe already thinking, whoa, we've just denied human nature and anything that makes any sense about what it means to be a man and a woman. How could you not be going far enough? Now, we're not done yet. She suggests that the very words and the accompanying concepts of woman and man are themselves problematic. They are, in fact, historical creations. They don't refer to something. In fact, in her book, Gender Trouble, which is probably one of the most influential books to be written on the subject in the past 50 years, she even goes so far as to say that the human subject, the I, the ego, is a creation of culture. Now, if there is no I, if there's no subject, then there certainly is no man or woman. Now, some people might think, as we're getting into this subject, it's kind of easy, right? Like, we can figure this out really simply. We know what a man and woman is. Let's look at the biological sex. That solves the problem, right? Well, she actually will suggest, first chapter, first thing that Judith Butler does is she says, yeah, you know that whole gender, biological sex distinction that we like to draw? Guess what? There is no such distinction. Gender just is biological sex, and biological sex just is gender. And you're everyone might here be thinking, perfect, we've got her. And then she'll go on and say, yeah. So when we say gender is fluid, what we mean is biological sex is fluid. A creation of culture. She says, it had been perhaps a helpful way of disputing the biology is destiny formula. However, it's no longer useful as a distinction. Rather, and I'll quote from her book here, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. She appears to be suggesting that if sex is itself a cultural context, then we don't need to distinguish between the two of them. We can just talk about sex and talk about it as a culturally constructed norm. Part of what she does in her approach to this question is she's going to reject what Nietzsche would call, going back to René Descartes. So just for those of you who like the history of things, talking about the history of ideas, what we are dealing with today, what these books are based upon, can be traced back, according to the authors of these books, to a rejection of René Descartes, the French philosopher, in his, what they call in here, a metaphysics of substance. Now, Judith Butler doesn't reject, she doesn't argue against a metaphysics of substance, because as far as she's concerned, she doesn't have to. Nietzsche has already disproved it, as have many of the great philosophers preceding Judith Butler. So she doesn't have to argue against it. She can assume that it's been defeated. And so what she's going to suggest is, since there is no such thing as substances or natures, well, we haven't quite gone far enough. Sartre, or Foucault, seems to think that there are free-floating attributes, which we would call genders. So we often, I don't even know if we even think about what this means. I am a substance. I have attributes. I've got hair. I have brown hair. So you can go think about my hair, and my hair is brown. It's starting to turn white. That's what happens when you have kids hitting teenage years, for the record. Okay. Some people lose their hair. It's the same effect. It's the same thing. But what you have there is you have substance, and that substance it has accidents. That's a technical metaphysical term. All I'm saying is that you've got something that is, and there's something about that, such as, for example, the color, that can change without that underlying thing changing. The hair is still there. It's just the color that's different. And so what Foucault seems to be suggesting is, we got no substance. We've got no individual. There's no human being or human nature. But we can talk about gender. We can talk about man and woman. And Butler says, really? So if there's no substance, think here, this is a substance, okay? So if there's no substance and there's no, how do you have free-floating accidents? Like you have the color of brown or blue floating around the stage, right? Or there's maleness, right? Judith Butler's like, no, that makes no sense. You don't have free-floating attributes. She suggests that if that's the case, then what's left? And here's her answer. Gender proves to be performative. That is, constituting the identity it is purported to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed. On the contrary, if anything, you, the subject, are created by your very action. We could just trim this way down, and it'll be unnuanced, and therefore probably a really bad way of explaining it. But you could kind of trim it down to say, you are what you do. You're not human unless you do human things. You're not male unless you do male things. You're not female unless you do female things. If you happen to do canine things, well, guess what? You're a canine. Did you see the idea there? Okay. So if that's true, then all we get is performance or expression. Another way of putting this in her work is the following. Gender is nothing more than the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. Now, this can get really complex really quickly. In fact, reading Butler, you have to read her a couple times to understand where she's even going. It makes sense in an odd sort of way, but it makes sense. So let me try and explain a little bit of what she's trying to get at. This might be scary for some people. Please don't be terrified. I'm going to use myself as an example. Sometimes when we talk about transgender theory, and I think rightly, we sometimes get the impression that what they are saying is something like this. I believe that I am, fill in the blank, therefore I am, same thing, and if you tell me I'm not, then you're wrong. Like that's one way in which transgender theory is presented, is it not? I believe that I am, therefore I am. So I believe that I'm a pirate. So guess what? I'm a pirate. And if you tell me the contrary, you're immoral. Another way that we sometimes hear transgender theory presented is we say that I am. So it's not a question necessarily of belief. It might be going a step further than belief. I say that I am, whatever, fill in the blank, I'm a pirate. Therefore, if you say the contrary to me, you are assaulting me verbally. Why? You are attacking my identity. I am a pirate, and you are undermining my very being. You are attacking what I am if you say that I am not what I say that I am. That's another way in which it's presented. Now, Judith Butler, it does not quite go that direction. But there are people who do, in fact, think that the way that we talk about something changes what it is, and there is a sense in which that's true. There's a sense, a small, and I think it's important that we understand that sense. Okay? So we're going to think about something like this. Think about a person who is treated their whole life by their parents, by their school teachers, by people in authority, as if they are worthless. Their parents continually tell them how idiotic they are, continually tell them how stupid they are. How could you be so stupid? You moron. You're worthless. What does that child come to think of themselves? They come to indeed act in that way. There is a way in which our words, the things that we say to people, do in fact form their character. You could say it. I don't like saying it this way because it can create confusion, but you can actually say it the following way. How we talk to people makes them to be what they are. That's part of what they're getting at. When the transgender theorist is talking about how our words and even our actions form our being, that's what they're getting at. That's what they're pointing at. How about this? Again, I'll use myself as an example because I see myself doing it, and people, those of you who know me, if I've ever done this to you, I'm sorry, straight up, right? Half the time, I'm probably not even aware that I'm doing it because my mind is way out in the clouds somewhere, okay? And so please forgive me if you've ever been offended by me doing this. Just forgive me, please, and just write this off as, Haines is absent-minded. You're talking, right? You're talking. I'll use me as an example. You're talking to me, and then all of a sudden you notice my facial expression, and my facial expression has a sense perhaps of irritation on it. Or you realize that the lights that were there in my eyes as I was looking at you at first, they're gone. Now, what impression does that give you? He doesn't care. He feels like I'm wasting his time. Now, I assure you that is most certainly not the case. It's my own fault, and I will say I'm so sorry if I've done this to you, but it was certainly not intentional. I get distracted so easy that I'll listen to a lecture, like the one that I'm giving now, and somebody says something, and I'm gone. Like, I am out in some other book in another realm, and all of a sudden he says something else, and I'm like, whoa, that's 40 minutes in. Where'd the time go? Right? That's how I am, right? And so it's certainly not intentional, but we do that all the time. Now, imagine if your parents did that to you growing up all the time. What does that tell a child? I'm not even going to bring up the question of legitimate sexual abuse and how that changes the way a person acts, how they think about reality and how they think about themselves. When we act dismissively towards people, intentionally or unintentionally, we are showing them by our actions that they don't matter. And that impacts us. We are telling them that they are not worth it. Now let's take this a step further and apply this to gender. Now again, I'll use myself as an example. We do the same thing with gender all the time. I had great parents, and they raised me well. And how did I learn to be a man? By watching my dad be a father. And how did I learn to treat my mother? women? By watching my dad and how he treated women, specifically my mother. And how did I learn that women should act? By watching my mother and seeing how she acted. Now, there's more than that. That's not the only thing. I was an ardent reader, I think that's the right word, of Louis L'Amour. Some of you know who that is. I still have almost the entire works of Louis L'Amour hidden away in my house somewhere, hidden because Louis L'Amour is not looked upon as something that you should be proud of owning. But they're there, I'm telling you. And I read these, I could read 2 of these in a day. And one of the things they taught me was what it means to be a man. Guess what? Men don't cry. Men are not afraid of anything. I can sleep alone in the forest at night, and I'm not terrified, as long as there's no crazy noises. There was one night I woke up in the house and was terrified because I heard a fox outside. And let me tell you, if you've ever heard that song, What Does the Fox Say? It does not sound like anything in that song. It's the thing of horror movies. I ran and checked all of my kids to make sure they were all still alive and breathing, like literally, But that's what I was taught growing up, is that to be a man is to not cry, to be tough. That formed my idea of what it means to be man. That's how we learn to be men. Now, there's a problem here because in a lot of transgender discussion on both sides of the divide, when we talk about what it means to be man or woman, we almost always appeal to aspects of being a man and a woman which have nothing to do with being a man or a woman. And so, as I was driving in this morning, I was talking to Dr. McLaughlin about this just before, I was really tempted. It crossed my mind, I should have put my kilt on. For 2 reasons. One, because a man wearing a kilt in North America just seems weird. It's like, why are you wearing a dress that's plaid? However, go to Scotland, where at least half of my heritage comes from. And you can even go look this up online, and on a kilt maker, like that they produce kilts, they will say, history of the kilt, almost the first paragraph, the kilt is it's the highest sign of masculinity. Like, you want to be a man, wear a kilt, if you're Scottish. And I thought, I should have worn that, but I'm not going to. So in the discussion on at least not for this presentation, in the discussion on gender, we can talk about different types of characteristics. We can talk about primary, secondary, tertiary, and even 4th level characteristics of manhood and womanhood. And in the history of the debate, this was one of the ways that we talked about it. And guess what? Wearing a dress, that goes down into the 4th level. So does having long hair. So does wearing pink. So does writing poetry. So does liking flowers. So does enjoying the act of cooking. Now, I'm throwing a lot of these things out here, I hope, for very obvious reasons. Because a lot of times when we think about what does a man do and what does a woman do, especially as we're raising boys, and I'll use myself as an example because I don't mind putting myself on the spot. When I'm distributing the tasks for my children at home as they reach the appropriate ages, well, guess who gets to mow the lawn? My boys. Even though my daughter would have loved to ride that riding lawnmower, wasn't a man's job. Neither was taking out the trash. That's also a man's job. Point here is that when the transgender theorist is pointing at what it means to be a man and a woman, and then they say something like what Judith Butler says, that to be a man is culturally defined, they're pointing at those things. Because when I walk up here, that's another thing I could have brought, man. There's so many things I could have brought to illustrate this point. I've got 2 double-bit axes and a chainsaw at home. Man, you walk into a place with a double-bit axe and everyone's like, oh, there's a man, right? Wrong. But that's part of what we think. I've got a beard. He's a man. Sorry, C.S. Lewis. Honorary bearded gospel man. We talk as if fourth level things are what it means to be male or female. And then we're surprised when the transgender theorist turns around and says, well, if that's what it means to be male and female, then guess what? That's culturally determined. In Scotland, the manly man wears a kilt. In the Middle East, men wear long robes and happily wear pink. I also happily wear pink, I just don't have it on me today. I also like flowers. All of my friends on Facebook get annoyed with the fact that I share so many pictures of flowers and mushrooms from the forest, or anywhere I happen to see them. I cook. Not nearly as good as my wife. She is excellent, but I make a mean Chicago deep dish pizza. And for some reason, that does not affect me in my understanding of what I am. This is what Judith Butler is saying, that to be masculine or feminine is to do that which is masculine or feminine. She takes it further than those fourth level things. Guess what? You grow a beard, doesn't matter what your sex is, biologically, you're a man. She takes it further than that, and I'm not going to get into the details, but if you do actions which would normally be associated with male sexuality, doesn't matter what your biological sex is, you are a man. If you do sexual actions which are normally associated with women, then you are, for Butler, a woman. It doesn't matter what your biological sex is. It doesn't matter what organs you have. On the contrary, for Butler, we can even go further and say that matter itself of your body is defined through cultural discourse and the actions that you do within that cultural discourse. Now, one thing that she does, and this is the next step of her argument, because it might sound like, where are we going with this? The next step of her argument is this. If you happen to be looking around society and you see someone who does not fit that male or female norm, what do you do? Like, you're driving down the street and you see a person walking on the side of the road, and you can't tell, based upon the outside appearance, whether that is a male or female. What do? You question. You ask the legitimate question, is that a male or a female? And what Judith Butler is suggesting is that when we see things like that, it produces what Thomas Kuhn talks about in his work on scientific paradigms. It creates a paradigm shift because all of a sudden we have seen the world as two sexes, male and female, and all of a sudden we start seeing things which appear to not fit within that paradigm, and they're outside of the lines. They've transgressed the limits. And for Butler, what that does is it questions the so-called historical, cultural, linguistic norms. And therefore, for Butler, one of the best ways, in fact, to problematize, is what she's going to say, or question those norms, is for people to dress in drag. Because it causes you to question the sexuality of that individual. And then society starts asking, maybe we've got the wrong norms. Maybe what we thought was male and female isn't. Maybe there's a third category or a fourth category. And Judith Butler is there with the answer. Guess what? Gender is what you do. And so technically, there are as many genders as there are sexual activity. All right. I hope that that is clear as it can be. It's perhaps not what you thought it was. That's okay. That's where we are, so let's deal with it. And guess what? That's what the philosophy is, and science has jumped to the rescue of philosophy. You could, I didn't bring with me one of the histories of transgenderism. I've got a couple of books in my office on the history of transgenderism and the history of the sexual revolution. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that early on in the 1900s, already in the 1910s, scientists were already attempting to change the sex of animals. In the 1920s, German scientists were already trying to change the sex of humans. So we also need to get this out of our mind that's like, oh, where did this come from? No, this has been around for over 100 years. Within the scientific community, we're not even talking about the philosophical community. Within the scientific community, this has been around for over 100 years. In fact, if you read an interesting history of transgenderism, they'll trace it right back to Joan of Arc, at very least, and propose that Joan of Arc was transgender. In North America, if we kind of come to North America, one of the landmark events that took place in North America was in the early 1950s when a World War II vet who was born under the name of George William Horhenson Jr., I think that's how to pronounce his last name, but I'm going to admit I'm not 100% certain. He transitioned from male to female, becoming Christine Horhenson, between the years of 1950 and 1952. Now, transition surgery had already been started taking place early on in the 1920s. So this is not something that is new. It's not like, oh, well, it's the first time. No. It was, however, widely broadcast across the United States, and this individual became a Hollywood star and starred in many movies. And what ended up happening is it popularized this notion that I could change my sex. Because you all of a sudden put a person in stardom as a model to follow. At the same time as transitioning surgeries are being performed, you've also got anthropologists and psychologists such as Margaret Mead and John Money and Alfred Kinsey and others theorizing about the very nature of sexuality and questioning the claims that there were in fact only two sexes. The medical sciences claim to be able to turn us into whatever we want to be. Man to woman, woman to man, humans to whatever they can imagine. Political technique and the manipulation of language has jumped to the rescue of philosophy and medical sciences by making it possible to talk as if the modern remaking of man was in fact a reality. And when I say political, I don't mean just the politicians, I mean also education. Where children are being told that they need to think about what they are. Now, I would like to suggest as a small, quick parenthesis here that this would entail that our children are victims. And so we need to be very careful about how we talk about people who identify as transgender, because they have been told, if they grew up any time after 2000, they have been told that there are not two genders or two sexes. As children, consistently being told that they should question their sexuality. Are we surprised that they do? And then on top of being told that in their schools, government has come along and said, oh, and guess what? Anyone who says they can't can lose the right to have their children, because that would be considered child abuse. Our politicians have encouraged our education, and so we are raising our children to question their very sexuality. We shouldn't be surprised if they do. In the last act of his performance, the actor Mankind has pulled off the greatest magic trick. And by the way, I like that analogy because I've done gospel illusions before, and I'm semi-pro juggler. He's pulled off the greatest magic trick. He disappeared by becoming everything but himself. You've ever heard of the trick of the disappearing magician? Well, that's what mankind has done. We pull off the mask and discover that there is, in fact, nothing behind it. So what I want to do, in what time I have left? Oh, I've got time. So what I want to do for the next part, now that I've introduced the problem and hopefully made it palpably real, is I want to look at what C.S. Lewis had to say about it. And if I have time, Martin Heidegger. But that would be like turning the gears up really high, jumping into the deep end of the pool. So we'll do that if we have time, and if we don't, well, guess what? We can, for another time. February 1943, C.S. Lewis delivers 3 lectures, the Riddell Memorial Lectures. They, at the University of Durham, these 3 lectures were published in the same year and became known as The Abolition of Man. This is, sometimes we read this as if the whole book was a single thing. It was 3 lectures. And so you can actually read each of them independently, though they do fit together quite well. C.S. Lewis, I would suggest to a certain extent this book was somewhat prophetic. However, it did speak to what was happening in his own time. In fact, C.S. Lewis is not the only deep thinker to be working in the 1940s and 50s to have said things like this. One of my good friends and colleagues, Timothée Davy, as we were talking about this, reminded me frequently that Jacques Ellul, a French theologian and philosopher, discusses exactly the same types of ideas in his book, for example, The Technological Society, which was written originally in French, was published in 1954. We also find similar themes in the more enigmatic writings of Martin Heidegger. Guess what? Also published in the 1950s. Interestingly enough, as I have talked with Timothée Davy, and I myself studied Martin Heidegger in great depth, I have found no evidence of any connection between C.S. Lewis, Heidegger, and Ellul. It's almost as if they were working in worlds of their own, which is actually not kind of surprising because Heidegger was in Germany, Ellul in continental Europe as well, probably France or Belgium, and C.S. Lewis in England. And so they're all working at the same time. And also, just to kind of really make this interesting, so are Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Same time period. Jacques Ellul, sorry, not Jacques Ellul, Jean-Paul Sartre gave the published version of his lecture, The Existentialism is a Humanism. He gave that in 1945. And Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex was published in 1949. So all of these works that I've been talking about here, they're all coming out within the space of about a decade of each other. They're all seeing the same things and asking the same questions and trying to provide similar solutions. So what is going on in The Abolition of Man? I'm thinking primarily of the final article called The Abolition of Man in this work. And in The Abolition of Man, the key theme is that somehow some men are going to become the creators of a new type of man. He begins by making it abundantly clear that man, in his attempt to subjugate nature. Now, when you think about this, just think about the fact that we go out and we strip mine entire plots of land. We subjugate nature. We go in and we tear down entire forests to make wood. Subjugate nature. We take it and we bend it to our will. And so he suggests that the real danger, the problem of the subjection of nature to our human impulses is that nature becomes something that is not a thing in itself, but rather something for man to dominate, subjugate, manipulate, and modify. For my purposes, my desires, what I want. And here's the next problem. By approaching nature in this way, we humans risk becoming the final part, says C.S. Lewis, of the domination of nature. Because guess what? We are a part of nature. Not in the sense that not in the sense, in a very real sense, which in fact did take place, of the slavery of men to men, but rather a view of human nature by which we humans control, determine, and modify not just our physical appearances, but our very natures themselves. It's that we actually decide now, we determine what it means to be human. And this is where the subjugation of nature takes us. He says, each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Man's final conquest, he says, proves to be the abolition of man. He takes off the mask, and guess what? Nothing's there. The driving idea is the following, and I'll quote directly from page 67. Their extreme rationalism, by seeing through all rational motives, leaves them creatures of wholly irrational behavior. We become our passions, and we are driven by them. If you will not obey the Tao, says C.S. Lewis, or else commit suicide, obedience to impulse, and therefore in the long run to mere nature, is the only course left open. Now, that statement is very profound, especially when we consider the fact that nature has multiple meanings. And so does, and for C.S. Lewis, the Tao, T-A-O, stands for what a lot of other theologians and philosophers have called natural law. He's referring to the same thing. The Tao equals natural law for C.S. Lewis. So this is what he seems to be saying. Here's the irony of his statement. The word nature can be taken to refer to the essence of a thing, so what a thing is. But it can also be, and often is, used to refer to the untamed living parts of the sensible cosmos, like the forest that I talked about earlier, that I'm able to sleep in at night in the dark, by myself, purportedly. The rules of engagement in nature are, to quote Tennyson, nature is a world of strife and conflict and violence, red in tooth and claw. In nature, the rules of engagement are, to the victor goes the spoils. It is the rule of the most powerful. That's nature. Living in the city, we often don't think about that fact. Though one of my students recently saw a hawk terrorizing a turtle dove. That's nature. Nature is your outdoor cat bringing back a mouse or a mole and toying with it before it kills it and devours the whole thing. And you keep the door closed so that it doesn't come in while it's doing that. And yes, I speak from experience. Lewis's point here seems to be that if we deny the Tao, that is natural law, then we become enslaved to our impulses, rejecting, remodeling, or self-determining our very nature, what we are. In the end, we become slaves of nature, no different from nor better than wild animals. By abandoning natural law, what Lewis calls the Tao, we become enslaved to a different type of nature. And if you want to know what that might look like, go read C.S. Lewis's The Space Trilogy. He has a beautiful or terrifying portrayal of what that might look like. So how does he approach this? We've got the problem. Now what do? The first approach, he starts diving into the subject and trying to dive it a bit deeper, like what's going on here. He first begins by looking at how man has won power over nature. And guess what? In our lifetimes, we've seen it in a way that's never been done before. I asked my children when my grandmother, their great-grandmother, turned, I think, 80, I had my kids do a timeline of her life, pointing out some of the salient features of world history in her lifetime. It was incredible. I mean, even in my lifetime, just this technology. My kids don't know what it's like to not have, or at least close somewhere in the house, this type of device. I didn't have anything close to this type of device till I was well in my 20s. That's technology and how fast it's advanced. Now, C.S. Lewis is going to point to things like this. He's going to point to things like the airplane, the radio, contraceptives, which in their modern form as pills were invented in the 20th century. And they were applauded by the feminists as finally giving women the same freedoms as men. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. What they meant by that was, men have free sex. Women can't. Why? Because when women have free sex, they get pregnant. And so they applauded the invention of contraceptives because it allowed women to have sex without consequences. Again, consequences equals having children. Lewis says this on page 54 to 55, man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor of this technology, since he is the target. He is the target both for bombs that come from planes and for propaganda, which comes from the radio. Now that's being written in 1940s, 50s. Could you imagine if he was living today? I mean, you open this thing, and you've got propaganda on every swipe of the finger. It's no longer just in our houses, it's in our pockets. We are this target of our technology. It could be argued, in fact, that man is less a possessor of these types of technologies and more the subject. Man is the possessed. It's very interesting to think about the contraceptive pills in particular. In relationship to contraceptive pills, Lewis notes that it is not living human beings who are the subject, that is the subjugated, but not yet living human beings. It's the next generation which are the subjugated when we talk about contraceptives. I'm not going to go into the history of eugenics. But eugenics, coming out of Darwinism, was an attempt to quite literally mold the next generation. And there is currently technology out there right now, which I don't fully understand, by which they are able to go into genes of an unborn infant and modify them to remove possible flaws in their gene strings. Now, this is not technically legal, I think, as far as I know, for humans, but it has been done in China. It seems that by our technological ability to control, mold, and subjugate nature, we become the subjugated remakers of our own nature. This, argues Lewis, means that man's conquest over nature, that is, his own nature, becomes the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions. Not just those who are currently living today, but those who are going to live. Your future children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-great, and so on. All fall under the dominion of a few elites as they define and redefine what it means to be man, woman, and human, and then determine how the next generations are going to be man, women, and human. Like, this is C.S. Lewis in the 1940s, and if it didn't seem apparent then, I would argue that it's right there now. Like, you can see it, it's in your face. That's why I say he's prophetic. At this point, he suggests an important nuance. And I think this is a nuance that we have to understand. Men have always molded men. Always. We've always been the molders of men. Except that prior to the technological reformation, we can call it, if we want to call it that, we molded them without technology per se. We molded them by teaching, by modeling. Right? I talked about how my parents molded me. I talked about how Louis L'Amour molded me and my perception of what it means to be a man. That wasn't with cell phones, because they didn't exist back then. Or at least if they did, they cost too much for my family to have them. It was through reading, it was through teaching, it was through modeling what it means to be man and a human. Lewis, therefore, is going to note two major differences between the man-molding endeavors of the past generations and the man-molding endeavors of today. He actually points out three. In this section, he points out two, and then in a later discussion, he points out a third. So I'm going to bring all three of them out here. First one is this. Whereas past generations were held back by their technological and medical abilities, like they just didn't have the ability to do what we can do today. He says this, and I quote, "The man-molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique." Like, I don't know about you guys, that kind of terrifies me, because I look around and that's kind of what I'm seeing. An omnicompetent state and almost a seemingly all-powerful technique in science. Like, again, prophetic. This can make us think of the transgender ideology, the medical technology backing it up, our public educators, which are forcing our children or pushing upon our children that they should be thinking about this, and the laws which require it. The second major difference that Lewis suggests is that in the past, he doesn't put necessarily a date on it, but I'll propose a date, prior to the 1900s. In the past, the man-molders of the past thought that, well, I should put it this way, they still thought that they were under natural law. That there were normative aspects of what it means to be a human written within nature itself by its creator. They were still under natural law, and they saw themselves as such, and therefore they allowed their man-molding endeavors to be guided by natural law, the Tao. However, since at least the 1800s, if not even a bit earlier, the end of the 1800s, this is no longer the case. Contemporary man-molders have thrown off the constraints of human nature by rejecting the very notion of natural law as anything other than what they decide is good or evil. By their own omnipotent will, they've elevated themselves to quasi-divine status and made themselves the arbiters of right and wrong for all other humans. This is what C.S. Lewis says on page 61 and 62 when he says this: "Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive, of education." The conditioners have been emancipated from all of that. They know how to produce conscience and decide what kind of conscience they will produce. The conditioners then are to choose what kind of artificial Tao, that is, what artificial norm of morality they will, for their own good reasons, produce in the human race. This is why, if you go back to that story I told at the beginning, parents may be growing up with children who are asking questions, or grandparents may have grandchildren who are asking questions that they never in their life would have entertained, because their children and grandchildren have been given by the man-molders of today an entirely new morality. Not only have they recreated mankind, they have recreated our standards of what it is to be a good or a bad human. In the third difference that Lewis notes between the man-molders of the past and the present is that those of the past actually saw themselves as part of the human race and set about helping future generations to become truly flourishing human beings. The man-molders of today deny the very, we talked about this right at the beginning. That's why I want to start with Judith Butler and the transgender movement. They deny the very existence of a human nature. They are themselves not human. How could they be? There is no humanity. They see themselves as above human nature. They have ceased to be human. C.S. Lewis says in his terms, page 63, they are rather not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Third book of the Space Trilogy, if you want a really well portrayed illustration of what he's talking about here. good, bad, human, and person are all just verbal signs that are without an object. They don't point to anything for the new man molders of today. I'm contemplating whether I jump into Heidegger at this point. Though our social elites are clearly leading us in this direction, they are being followed, and this is worth pointing this out. Yes, you can see this very clearly at the level of social elites, politics, those who determine educative programs, like what is going to be taught in the schools and how it's going to be taught. You can see that there. You can see that in the medical sciences. You can see that in the high-level thinkers of our society. However, they are also being followed, encouraged, and even promoted to semi-divine status by our society at large. They are the new priests of a new religion. However, I'd like to help us think about it this way. An entire generation has bought into this philosophy, amazed by magical illusions of its attending technology, and before they were even aware of it, they were tricked into believing a lie. It's the new orthodoxy. Those are the old world of the new heretics. Okay, I'll do something quickly on Heidegger. I've got some time, I think. All right, something really quickly. I'm not going to dive in too deep because, like I said, it's really deep. And it's deep not because it's that deep, it's just deep because of the words he uses. So what he does in his article called The Question Concerning Technology is he asks the exact same question as C.S. Lewis, but he says before we can really think about what technology is or how we use it or it uses us, we got to know what the essence of technology is. And so he dives into that question and says, what is technology? And in fact, he says, if we don't think about this, like if we don't think about what technology is, we will in fact become its slaves. Which, again, I mean, C.S. Lewis just said that, right? We just saw that with the abolition of man. So what is technology? Well, oftentimes, he says Heidegger, when we think about what is technology, we think about two things. So we think, one, technology is a means to an end, and we think of technology as a human activity. In other words, technology is an instrument. And that's how not growing up with this in my hand and pocket all the time, I've come to see this as an instrument, right? It's something that I use. That's what we mean when we think about technology. You don't even have to think about like computers. You can think about a hammer, a spoon. That's technology. It's something that you use as a means to accomplish some end that you desire. If we think about it that way, then it seems like we master it. We are the masters of our technology. However, he suggests that maybe there's a difference here, something that we need to go further into this question. Maybe we need to go a little bit deeper. And he says that maybe we can't just see it as a mere means, which suggests that it's more than just a means. And so to do that, to push us further, he asks, what do we mean by technology? And he says it actually comes from a Greek word called techne. This is what he says. One is that techne is the name not only for the activities and skills of the craftsman, but also for the arts of the mind and the fine arts. So techne is two things. It's something like a phone, a hammer, a spoon, stuff that you use to get stuff done. That's what we think about when we talk about the word technology. But the word techne also refers to something like a poiesis. It's a skill or an ability used in the fine arts. It's a bringing forth. It's a manifesting of something. And so you can think about drama, paintings, sculptures. It's Michelangelo going to that chunk of marble and bringing out David. Or Leonardo painting the Mona Lisa, revealing her, you might say. That's techne. So we've got those two ideas here. And he asks if there's a difference between them. First, he recognizes there's a sense in which modern technology does bring to the forefront that which is unseen, kind of like the old sense of the word techne as the ability to create something. But he also says that modern technology, if we think about our modern uses of it, is actually, and note how close this is to what C.S. Lewis said, it is a challenging and supplanting of nature for the sake of commanding, owning, extracting, and ultimately dominating. Technology turns everything and everyone, for Heidegger, into a resource. It's a resource. And I think if Heidegger were here today, guess what he would say? It turns even mankind, you, into a resource for another human. Interestingly enough, you know what the title is for the person in an organization who both hires and maintains people to make sure that they're all happy? Human resources. Yeah. Heidegger today be like, et voila! Humans, by technology, have become resources for other humans. In fact, arguably, I think you could say that because of our mindset in North America, we've turned God into a resource. This is what he says: nature, even man, is a mineable resource for mankind's own needs. Sometimes something that we need to keep on hand, just in case we need it. And he says this is actually the first danger of modern technology, is that man comes to the point where he himself will have to be taken as a standing reserve. And if you're trying to figure out if you don't know what that means, that's your little place at home where you keep all the food. That's the garage where you've got all the tools. That's the little thing in the backyard, which for some reason just the name of it slipped my mind, where you keep the lawnmower and everything else. That's a standing reserve. Like, nobody's constantly riding the lawnmower. Well, I mean, yeah, I saw what you're thinking there. Like, my kids wish they were, because it's kind of fun. It's there just in case, right? We keep it on hand because we might need it someday. And guess what? Today, you all are a standing resource because of technology. Meanwhile, man, precisely as the one so threatened, exalts himself and postures as Lord of the earth. This is what Heidegger says. In this way, the illusion comes to prevail that everything man encounters exists only insofar as it is his construct. This illusion gives rise in turn to one final delusion. It seems as though man everywhere and always encounters only himself. The second danger of modern technology, says Heidegger, is that we no longer see man or even God for what they are. We don't see people anymore as anything more than resources, things that I can use for my benefit. They have lost their dignity as human beings. They are a resource for me. They are a resource for our politicians. Their fundamental character is no longer human. As with Lewis, then, Heidegger sees, and I'm not going to go any deeper into this because it goes a bit further down the rabbit hole. I think we can get what we need from him there. He says the same thing as C.S. Lewis. We have made ourselves into essentially lumber. So what do we do? Are there any remedies? I suspect that more dangerous than any of the recent pandemics is this ideology spreading throughout the world. Now, here's what I would suggest. The ultimate remedy is to turn the eyes of this generation away from themselves and their project of literally epic proportions. That is the recreation of man in whatever image he can. I mean, think about the burden on your shoulders, the shoulders of each one of you, if you are the one that determines what you are. That is an enormous burden for a child to bear, let alone an adult. So we need to turn their eyes away from that project towards Christ, who Christ took upon himself human nature, was born as a baby, died and rose again for humans, as human, for the redemption and reformation of humanity. into his own image. We need to turn somehow the eyes of mankind away from himself to the one that he should be, in fact, imitating, the true human. What we are, in fact, meant to be. That is a major project. That's one project that we're trying to do here at this college. That's what project that I think all Orthodox churches are trying to do. Here's the question, though: how do we do it? So here's the project. Okay, great. Now, how do we get there? Well, I don't have all of the solutions, and I'm going to provide one solution that we often think of, and what I think that we need to keep in mind if we're going to do that one. And then I'm just going to look at what C.S. Lewis says, all right? And leave you guys to think about how can we work on this in our current situation. So first of all, one way of doing this, I think, should be fairly obvious. Train more pastors and missionaries to go out and preach the gospel. Like I think that's kind of an obvious solution. Again, that's what we're doing here at Bethlehem. However, I want to add a quick nuance there. And I'm going to use patristic language to give the nuance. If you're going to send a doctor to heal the sick, they better know about the illness. Because a lot of times, the sick person doesn't realize they're sick. And a lot of times, the remedy hurts or smells a lot worse than the sickness. Many of you may have had this experience. I have a friend, a dear friend back home, who started recently a very, very, very severe, life-threatening remedy for a very rare cancer. He was told going into it that he has about a 50-50 chance of living. If he doesn't do it, he's definitely going to die within the year. If he does do it, he might get a couple more years to live. Maybe. If you're going to go talk to sick people, you need to know what the remedy is. You need to know what the sickness is, and you need to know how to encourage the person who's sick to realize that they're sick and that they need to take the remedy. So what's the point of saying that? Our pastors and missionaries, then, if they're going to be working in any Western society, they need to know transgender theory really well. They need to know how to interact with people who have been deluded by transgender philosophy. They need to know how to bring them to the remedy, who is Christ, having first shown them that they are indeed sick. And so I would suggest that, therefore, training for our pastors and missionaries must include training in at least this transgender philosophy, if not just a quick history of philosophy in general. They need to know how to heal the sickness and to recognize it. Okay, Heidegger gives a quick solution. We'll get to Lewis. Heidegger's solution to the problem of the domination of techne is the other form of techne, art. And that sounds like a really simplistic solution. It's like, hey, how do we make sure that we don't become enslaved by technology? Well, let's do the fine arts. Interestingly enough, that's actually a solution that C.S. Lewis himself proposes in The Great Divorce. In The Great Divorce, we find an artist who is on an excursion from hell to heaven. He arrives at a kind of middle place, and he's met by a friend, a fellow former artist from Earth. And the fellow artist seeks to convince him about what his art used to mean. At first, the artist, when painting, saw light behind everything, and through their artwork sought to portray that light to the person who looked at their art. And after a while, they became enamored with types of brushes and types of paints and mixing their own paints and types of canvases and technique, rather than the original love, which was the light shining through nature. His first love was that light. And Heidegger points out that the purpose of artwork, of the fine arts, of literature, is to point man to the God who created the cosmos. And so Lewis seems to suggest that, one way in which we can reach out to a drowning world is by throwing them beauty in literature and art. Because through those beautiful things, guess what? They are pointed towards the light, the true beauty, which those beautiful things are just imitating. That is God. So art is a possible solution. Heidegger wasn't entirely wrong on some things. What are C.S. Lewis's two other solutions? First of all, in his article, and this is where we're going for this, there may be other solutions. I'm not going to try and give you every idea here. I just want the two that he provides in his article. Solution number one is a return to natural law. It's a return to natural law. In order to avoid the tyranny of our impulses and animal appetites, says C.S. Lewis, a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not a tyranny or an obedience which is not a slavery. And this is true on both the level of the individual human person and on the level of society. Individually, we as humans need to return to the idea that there is indeed an objective moral law which is over all human beings. The tyranny of the appetites is defeated by a recognition that our appetites are the basest part. They are a part, an important part, but they are the basest part of our human nature. They must be limited and restrained by right reason in submission to natural law, and Christians, by the Word of God. We must recognize, as individuals, that throughout the history of humanity, from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Cicero to the current day, some of the greatest philosophers and theologians of the past have argued that there is indeed a law which is written in the heart of all men, and that we must submit to it. On the socio-political level, the only way to avoid the tyranny of our political leaders and our societal leaders over any nation or group of people is that we firmly and unapologetically maintain that all men, including our leaders, submit to and obey natural law. Nobody escapes it. Not the president, not the director of the CDC, not the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm Canadian. I gotta throw that out there. All men are under natural law. All men must submit to it. Interestingly enough, what that means, and if you want to know more about natural law, because I don't have time to dive into all of the beautiful intricacies of natural law, I've got a book on it. You can go talk to Matt Lund at the bookstore. It's a nice little introduction, and I emphasize the little and introduction to natural law. Get a hold of it and read it, and hopefully that can be a good help for you to understand what it is. Scriptures and Christian theologians throughout the centuries have taught that natural law is flowing out of eternal law, and therefore to submit to natural law entails that you are in fact submitting to God. It's not something else that's apart. You've got God, and then what is natural law? Natural law is God's idea of what it means to be a human being. That's natural law. And so to submit to natural law is to submit to God, though we don't have to appeal, and let me make this clear, we don't have to appeal to revealed scriptures in relationship to politics. We can appeal simply to natural law. And therefore all humans should submit to it. That's Lewis's first remedy. His second remedy is interesting. I find it personally less convincing, but I do think it is still important. It's a renewed approach to the natural sciences. An approach to the natural sciences which is, in fact, holistic. We need to change the way we look at and study nature. We need to stop seeing nature as something to be dominated and subjugated to our desires, and rather as something that we are supposed to be aiding to flourish. We are keepers, not dominators. And there's a pretty good nuance. It means that we should not even do, says C.S. Lewis, to minerals and vegetables what modern science threatens to do to man himself. When it explained it, it would not explain it away. When it spoke of the parts, it would remember the whole. In other words, it would not be reductionist, lowering everything down to nothing but matter to be manipulated. It would recognize that this is in fact a creation of God, a gift of God. Both of these solutions could be summed up with a single proposition. We need to submit ourselves to reality instead of subjugating reality and ourselves to our own inordinate passions and appetites. And in so doing, we need to subject ourselves to God. That's not bad. I've still got a half an hour for questions and discussion or whatever. So let's do this. Questions. When you ask a question, please speak up so that I can hear it. I'll try to repeat it so everyone else can hear it. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if I can put this together. So, in trying to determine what do we do with this, so that's the big challenge, and that's what is posed originally here. Is, okay, as a parent, what do I say?
Yeah.
How do I deal with this? What I'm hearing through a lot of this is, while nuanced and a different focus, it sounds a lot like a retread of the truth relativism of postmodernism, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
It's just a different spin on it. And what they're doing as well is that they are also now, we're seeing a trend in scientific communities to basically disprove natural law by saying, well, even in the animal world, sexuality isn't so binary as we thought.
Yep.
Right? They're saying, oh, that's all relative too.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that argument has been out there, that what is truth, and if you talk to somebody that's struggling with this issue,
mm-hmm.
they're going to say, well, that's not my truth, that's your truth. So are we really trying to essentially go back to trying to have the debate again around, the relativism of truth? And is it really about sexuality, or is it really at a deeper level, like what you said, that answer of, well, we need to lead them to Christ, because quite frankly, I can't debate relativism of truth with somebody that doesn't hold that. How do we deal with that?
That's a good question, and it depends, I think, on who you're talking to. So, if you're talking to Judith Butler, you're going to have to know what she says. Like, you have to study really deeply and try and figure out what she says and how would you respond to it. But chances are most people, including myself, are not talking with Judith Butler. Most of the people that we are talking with are our friends, our colleagues, and our children and family members, right? So what do we do? Well, it depends on who it is. Children, I think we model it. I think we show it. That's what discipleship training is. We show them, in word and in action, what it means to be human, what it means to be a godly man and a godly woman. And that might mean that we have to confront our social and cultural stereotypes. That means that we have to be maybe a bit more thoughtful about it, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, if you're a woman, then you got long hair. That's going to create confusion. And so we have to get rid of certain, I talked about first, second, third, fourth level. We have to get those fourth level things out of our vocabulary. Because at the end of the day, some of the greatest poets of the past that we study were men. And so it's simply false to say, well, if you like poetry, then you must be a feminine, and getting in touch with your feminine side, right? And so we want to be careful to not fall into those types of things. So we model it. This is what it means to be a godly man and woman. And we don't have time to dive into all of those issues, because that's a whole other lecture. What does it mean to be a godly man? In fact, maybe a whole other class. But we model it, we show it in word and in deed. And we point our children to godly men. Not just ourselves. In fact, my goal with my children is that they be surrounded by other men so that they can see that where I've failed, they didn't, and so that they get a better picture of what it means to be a godly man. Not just me, because I'm a failure. Most obviously to my children. Right? So that's one thing. Now, let's say you're talking with someone who now has come to believe, yeah, no, transgenderism is true. What do we do? I have good friends like this, and I think that part of the answer is going to be, one, model Christian love. When I was young, modeling Christian love meant I'm going to throw the book at them. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you think that? Really? You know, and then let's dive into it, and by the end, I've made an enemy of a friend. They burnt the bridge. They're not going to listen to anything I say anymore. I have no way of getting to them because I've shown them hate rather than love. Now, showing love doesn't mean not saying the truth, okay? Let's be clear about that. It just means that you've got to be careful how you say the truth. And keeping in mind that many of the people that you are probably going to be interacting with are hurt by this very issue. It may mean that your first discussion is going to be painful for both of you. It's going to maybe conclude with, well, I've said my piece, and I won't say it again unless you bring it up. But if you bring it up, you can expect me to jump into it. Because I have my convictions, and I'm going to talk about them, right? And so it may mean that as well. It doesn't give clear answers. You may have to go back to relativism for this. With some friends, I've had to push them on some of these things, and sometimes to push them, you've got to say the things that seem the most absurd. It's like, so wait a second, you think it's okay morally to enjoy torturing newborn babies? And of course they say no. And then you say, well, then you think that there's something that's morally absolute, that it's wrong always and everywhere to torture and enjoy torturing babies. Well, if that's a moral truth, could there be others? Let's think about this and go further. Then you walk with them, right? You walk with them. And so yes, it is a question of relativism. Yes, you're going to have to go that direction. Hopefully not with everybody, because that can be tiring. Yeah, you have a question. Is that help, by the way? Yeah.
So I get some of the strategies at a relational, personal, individual conversational level. So you're a church in a smaller community, and you're trying to balance that with holding your local hospital, political, and educational leaders accountable. Some strategy of how to do that in a way that doesn't burn all your relational bridges.
Yeah, that's a hard one too. I do think it's going to have to be relational again, honestly. And the reason why is because we're dealing with a subject that touches people to their very core. And when it comes to the medical thing, so you're in a small town, so you've got a single hospital, and you probably know at least some of the doctors who work there, right? So what do you do? Are they Christian? Are they not? Right? I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm just saying, like, I'm putting myself in that perspective. Are they Christian? Are they not? If they're Christian, my goal, personally, would be come alongside them and help them to think through, what do I do as a Christian provider of medicine? Are there limits that I need to place upon my own practice? And if so, how can I do that? And then I might honestly at this point say, hey, let's find a lawyer. How can I do that without getting in trouble politically, legally? Because I think it's important. That is definitely an important thing to do. On the other hand, if you know them and they're not Christian, you're probably going to be doing something like I just said here, talking with them and trying to find out ways to think about how to morally use medicine. It's one thing to have the technology, it's another thing to use it morally. And there are entire domains of thought and dozens of books published on moral medicine. Probably more than dozens. But so you're going to have those discussions. And if you don't want to burn the bridges, then you've got to do it personal. You've got to do it over coffee. You've got to do it at your house in the backyard with the bonfire. You've got to build those relationships so that you can have those discussions. You don't just walk in on them with the book and say, hey, Here's what I think. Because doing that immediately burns your bridges. But you don't want to, right? In a small town, you want to keep those bridges open. You want to build that community, and that is doable. But you got to do it carefully, and you got to keep those relationships. Okay, I saw your hand over here. I'll come over here. Yeah.
So I imagine for most of us here, we probably won't have the time like you to do a deep dive into Butler. So what would be like a go-to resource or two that you recommend for a Christian to understand this better? Like what would be a helpful resource or two?
My personal favorite at the time being is Carl Trueman's recent book. It's about that thick, the big one. I saw they have the small one out there, which is it's a slimming down of the original one that came out. I would suggest read the big one. I know it's more ominous and kind of like in your face because it's so big, but it's worth it, and it's worth it to take the time. And then honestly, I mean, you guys are here today, and so at the end of the day, if you're struggling with this and you're like, I got a question and I don't know what to do, like shoot an email to the college and say, hey, I've got a question for Dr. Haines or Dr. McLaughlin. He's sitting right here. I'm sorry for pointing you out there, but I mean, I've got a question for Dr. Haines, Dr. McLaughlin. I don't know how to deal with it. You know, we are happy. I mean, we're busy, so please don't expect, like with texting, that you're going to get a message back the same day within the next minute. So we're busy, but more than happy to say, hey, look, I get the problem. Let me see if I can work through with you and if it comes down to meeting and talking over coffee, I think that both of us would be happy to say, hey, let's find a time. It might not be this month, but let's find a time and let's do it. So we're here as a resource. Use us, please. But for something you can take home, Carl Trueman's book is a great place to start. Yeah. You got a question over here.
So I understand the relational aspect of it is very important in understanding where they're coming from. So I love that you point that out is first start learning this stuff, right?
Yep.
So family, obviously, you can't choose which placed us in that specific place for a reason.
Yes.
A family that's far away, because we're from Arizona, so you got family that you're dealing with these kind of these situations, and then the rest of the family's basically saying, you're yes, I'm fine with what you are, but obviously there's a conviction that that's not okay. So how do you do that distance-wise?
Yeah.
Is there like a period of time where there is like a lot of distance created to where they shut you out for a long period of time? Like, and I'm all about like in-person communication. I love people, so it feels like an almost impossible situation to be, 2,000 miles away. So what would be your suggestion or encouragement to be able to love and
Yeah, that's a hard one.
they may not even want to hear it right
Yep.
now. They want to be affirmed that
Yep.
what they're doing is okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And keeping in mind that they are seeking that affirmation, and what they are getting from everyone probably is rejection, and so they're seeking affirmation, right? So yeah, that is a huge deal, and I totally understand that. My family and friends, I've been down here for 2 years, but I'm from Canada originally, so I get the distance question. First of all, I would say don't. Do all that you can to not affirm that what they are doing is right. Right? So if they're posting about something that's like, here's what I think, don't like it. You don't have to hate it. Like, you don't have to put an angry sign, just leave it. Like, just, you know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking like a Facebook type thing. Just, oh, that happened. Keep going. Keep scrolling. That way, you're not creating a barrier that you can't do anything about anymore. Because if they cut you off, they've cut you off, you're done. Okay? So that's the first thing I would do, is certainly don't affirm it. Secondly, if you've got a personal relationship, then find ways to maintain those personal relationships, phone calls, Zoom calls, chatting, letting them know, hey, I know you're suffering. If you want to talk, I'm willing to just listen. That's it. Just listen. And then the other thing that I do personally, because I really want to win the person. I used to want to win the battle, and I realized you burn a lot of bridges that way. It doesn't. At the end of the day, that just creates more people that hate Christ instead of people that might be open to it. What I've started doing is that if someone asks me a question, so what do you think? Like, you've been listening, and then they say, so what do you think? my immediate response now is, that is an excellent question. Why don't you ask it to me when I'm sitting across the table from you drinking coffee, because I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole right now with 10,000 miles between us. Yeah. And that hurts a little bit for me as a philosopher personally, because it's like, man, I want to jump on this so hard. But saying hard truth comes across less pain-inducing when you're with someone and you can look them in the eyes and tell them you love them, cry with them, and say the truth.
So like, if it was just my husband and I in our home, that, like that, it would be a different situation, but you're also sending to that person and your children and people around you what you believe to be true. So that's another thing, is like trying to figure out, like, now they're not happy with me.
Yeah.
We're trying to protect. So then
You can send them materials.
the one, all right,
Yeah.
it's
Try sending them materials, but I mean, if you're trying to make sure you don't burn the bridges, if you want to make sure you don't burn the bridges, do it in the most loving way possible. You know, all of the qualifications ahead of time. You know, I love you, I'm here for you, I'm praying for you, I'm crying for you, it pains me, and here, I want you to read this. You know, something like that. Even then, my go-to answer typically is, hey, look, I'm going to be home this summer. Let's go out for coffee and talk about this then rather than now. Like, this is not a now thing. It doesn't have to happen now. We do, and maybe just a quick parenthesis, we live in a society where I get a text and the person expects me to answer now. And I'm actually, in my personal life, I have decided, my students all know this, I don't respond to emails now. If they put urgent, like life and death, in the subject, I will probably look at it and determine how urgent it actually is. But unless it says urgent, it's gonna wait a day or two in my mailbox before I even open it, because I'm trying to force myself to have this attitude of it. No, I don't have to answer everybody now. We can wait and build those relationships and have that, and create the relational, what's the word I'm looking for here? Credit, or is it debit? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like yeah, exactly. So that I can speak into their lives, rather than being someone who flies in from outside, drops a bomb, and flies off. I want to be the one that can sit there and build their lives with them. You see what I'm saying? And I know that's painful, because you sit back for a year or two watching and wishing and praying. But let me add on that. C.S. Lewis, The Efficacy of Prayer. Great article, read it. He points out that we sometimes get this impression that only our physical actions actually cause anything. Like, I'm picking up my thing and I move it across. Hey, look, I moved something. And if you were sitting with Andy Naselli, right, the other day, talking about divine sovereignty and all of that, you know, God sovereignly is a cause that allows me to have causality to move that cup, right? And so when I cause the cup to move, God causes me to cause the cup to move. And we are fine with that. That makes total sense. And for some reason, we seem to think that prayer is not working in the same way. And yet it does. And C.S. Lewis in The Efficacy of Prayer says exactly that. He says, why do we have a problem believing that my prayers at home in quiet in my room are less efficacious than my hand picking up that cup and moving it across the... And so that's the other thing I want to maybe add to that is, you got lots, if you can pray, you can pray hard. And that prayer is powerful, because God ordains that prayers are answered. Okay. I think I saw your hand come up over here. We got plenty of time still.
Yeah, so you've mentioned that things by means of technology make people into resources, and later on we no longer see man or God for what they are. Do you see this relating somehow to Nietzsche's famous words, "We have killed God," and "No, God is dead and we have killed him"?
I love that question. Okay, so I don't know if everyone heard it. Does technology? I'm not going to say it again, and you can just tell me if I got it right. Does my comments earlier about man no longer seeing man or God for what they are, but rather as a resource or technology, how does that relate to Nietzsche's statement that God is dead? It relates in the following sense, and Dr. McLaughlin, please correct me if you think I'm wrong on this. For Nietzsche, what that statement means God is dead and we have killed him, is that in so much as we as humans exist, the way that we exist, our mode of existing, we exist as if God didn't exist. And therefore, God effectively doesn't. And so it has to do with the way that you are, in fact, living your life. Interestingly enough, that is something that Stephen Charnock of Puritan discusses in his book, The Existence and Attributes of God, when he talks about practical atheism in the church. Even Christians live as if God didn't exist. And so it's the way we live, by our existence itself. And when he says existence, what he means is our lived human experience, we have killed God. Yeah. So how does that relate to what I said? What that means, what I would put this way perhaps, is that for some people in society, including many Christians, we live as if God was dead. For other people, also mostly Christians, we live as if God was basically our slave. We've made him into a resource that we go to when we need him. And so we live as if he's dead most of the time. And every once in a while, we go to that shed in the backyard and we pull out God and we say, look, I need the lawn mowed, let's go. And so we live, God is dead. And then every once in a while, he's our resource we run to when we need him. Okay, does that help with your answer? Great. Yep. Actually, I think I saw your hand up first, and then I'll come over to you.
Yeah, so on the point of keeping our relationships with transgender people or non-binary side, using pronouns becomes increasingly difficult as it's more prevalent and as you spend time with them and talking about other people that they know. And for me, it seems dishonest and not actually portraying what I believe to use their pronouns. But I'm trying to figure out if there's a way I can do that in good conscience, in being loving with them, but it doesn't look like I'm not telling the truth.
Sure, that's a good question too. And there was a recent article published on that by Rosario Butterfield. Thankfully, I read that article last night. Around midnight, I was like, I'm going to read through this quickly. I'm going to give you my opinion on it, recognizing this is really purely, this is my opinion. First of all, maybe, you like being called by your name, right? There's something about, when someone comes alongside you, and I'll use myself as an example, and they say, hey, David, good to see you, rather than, hey, you. You see what I mean, right? It's more personal. And so perhaps my first suggestion to you, to answer your question, would be something along the following lines. Why use personal pronouns at all when talking with that individual? And in fact, arguably, when you're talking with an individual, right, if Silas and I are standing here chatting, I'm not looking at Silas and saying he, him. Like that just doesn't, I can't do that, right? Unless I turn from Silas and look to you and then I say he. At which point I'm no longer talking to him, I'm talking about him, right? And so using when it comes to personal pronouns, first of all, why not just use their name and be so much more personal? So Silas and I were talking, I was talking with him. So that would be my first thing is, and to a certain extent, by doing that, you almost like put that whole question into a box and put it over in the corner and be like, let's not worry about this. This is really not that big of a deal. Okay, so that would be my first thought on that question. I'm not going to give any more thoughts because after that, it gets into a bit more strange territory, difficult territory, like talking about somebody else when they're not present. Do I use personal pronouns or not? That could bring up a whole different issue. Why are you talking about somebody else when they're not there? Like, is it in the good sense and the bad sense? Is it to demean them or to raise them up? Like, there are other questions that we can ask as well, and I'm not sure that I want to jump on that right here and now. My thoughts on that are not cemented into, I got a French phrase coming to mind, sorry. They're not in the cement, basically. So far, they're still on paper, and I'm chatting with friends about that question right now. That's all I can give you for answers. Is that okay? Great. You had a question, and then I see a hand back there.
Yeah. So, listening to your talk,
you alluded to a lot of things that I've learned throughout my past 3 years here. And like you mentioned, oftentimes you have to read philosophy several times to understand what they're even saying or what they're arguing.
Yeah.
What encouragement do you have for those of us here who may feel daunted at the task of addressing this issue or of immersing yourself into philosophy?
Okay, into philosophy itself, I would say, well, if you're here, you've got good guides. Dr. McLaughlin and I don't know, I'm not going to raise myself up as a good guide. Dr. McLaughlin is an awesome guide, and if he wants to say I am too, that's great. We can mutually raise each other up and say, we've got some good guides at school, follow them. I don't want to self-aggrandize, but in philosophy, at that level, follow the good guides, right? And make sure you choose good guides. But as for this specific issue, a couple things I would say. One, before you dive into this issue, make sure you are very well grounded, both biblically, but also philosophically. Like, you should know your Bible well and be nourished by it daily. And I'm saying this from experience. I've been researching this specific issue for I don't know how many years now. COVID kind of threw it off. I started sometime before COVID. I don't know how many years I've been doing this anymore on the specific issue. And I can tell you, there were days when I'm going from my office to home feeling dirty from what I had to read. Like, some of the stuff that's out there is just nasty. And unfortunately, some of us have to kind of wade through the mud so that we can say, hey guys, don't go there. So I would say if you're going to go there, make sure you're very, very, very well grounded, that you are praying, and that people around you know that you're going there, and that they're also praying with you and keeping you grounded and accountable, because it's very difficult to study on a spiritual level. First of all. Secondly, on the philosophical level, you can do it. Yeah, I have no, knowing you, knowing my students here, I have no doubt that any of you guys could seriously be able to pick up one of these books and wade through it and figure out what they're doing. I know you can. I have no doubts about it at all. And it took me a couple readings and a lot of rereadings of the same chapter to all of a sudden have like a little light bulb go, bingo, that's what she's doing, got it, right? So don't be daunted. Take it as a challenge. If you are going to go there, take that challenge. Just make sure that you are well-grounded, make sure that you are surrounded, and then do it. We need people thinking about this. We need people who are able to wade through that muck and mire and come out and protect the church. You know, as most of my students, as we've worked through the patristic authors, some of these authors, as they begin their works, right? You think about Irenaeus and his work on heresy. He says right at the beginning, he says, I'm not doing this because I thought it was going to be fun to read the heretics, right? Like, he's like, it's not like I said, hey, I'm going to go over and read all these heretical writers, yay! He said, I did this with, it was saddening, I hated it every minute of it, but I did it because I love the church. And it's my responsibility to protect the church from wolves. And I need to know how to recognize the wolves. And now I'm writing this, and he writes his book against heresy, is right to other pastors, to say to other pastors, I'm writing this to you so that you can do the same thing without having to do all the stuff that I did to be able to write this to you. And so we do need people doing this. People who are well-trained, like you guys. So don't see this daunting. See this more as like a David and Goliath type thing. David took out Goliath with a stone. So it can feel daunting. And it's hard work, but you can do it. Okay, other questions? Back there? Oh, and then I see your hand over there. Yeah.
Kind of follows on Titus's question, but so we have friends who work for city governments who are Christians, who are being, I'm guessing, forced to put their pronouns in their emails. And to me that feels like appeasement. I'm just kind of interested to know your thoughts, and then you discuss that with those people.
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I assume. Actually, I'm not going to take the situation particularly. Let's take a similar situation for an example. Let's assume that I am in politics, and in order for me to have my job, I must have my email signed with my name and my pronouns. Am I, by putting my pronouns down there, assuming that I put them down as he, him, like I'm correctly identifying myself with the proper pronouns, have I made a compromise somehow? Okay, that's a good question. There are different answers to this. I'm not sure that I'm willing to say that only one answer is the right answer. I'll give you an answer that I was told once. I was at a conference, and we were told, hey, if you're doing your PhD in the sciences, and you happen to believe that there's a God who created the cosmos, keep that to yourself until you finish your PhD. Like, you don't have to go running around preaching Genesis 1. And the reason behind that was because we need guys and women with PhDs in biology who believe that God created the cosmos. And if you're going to get kicked out of your program for believing that God created the cosmos, maybe just keep that to yourselves till you got your PhD so that we can have more PhDs. Okay, so that was one answer. Now, earlier you asked the question, like, what do I do? Like, do I keep quiet? I'm going to tell you, I don't like that answer personally. Because I kind of want to be like, no, God created the heavens and the earth. And when I was doing my PhD, I had no qualms about saying, no, there is a God and I can prove that he exists. And if you don't like that, then let's fight about it. Intellectually, obviously. Though it would have been fun to say, choose your weapon, let's go outside. Right? There's an aspect of that you kind of have this feeling like, I want to do this. I want to oppose the error. And we need men and women who are willing and able to do that. Yeah, we definitely do. If you're going to do that, you just got to recognize you might be putting your career on the line. And you've got to be willing to say, okay, I'm willing to put my career on the line for this specific question. I don't know. Part of me wants to do that. I don't know if I would for that. And I'll tell you, I think probably my wife wouldn't want me to do that for that either, right? And maybe it would be advantageous to have Christians who think strongly about this in politics, and who are willing to say, okay, you know what? I'll put my he, him down there, so that I can continue to have an influence here. However, that will certainly weigh on the individual, and that's going to be spiritually taxing being in that situation. And we can raise issues at this point of whether or not Christians should even be in politics. Right? So that's a very hard question. I'm not sure I can give an answer that I'm 100% certain is the right answer. I can tell you I have leanings in both directions. On my side, I want to be the one that's going out, okay, let's bring it on. And then but I also recognize that by doing that, I do put other people's lives in situations where it's like, okay, so what do I have to hunt for a new job now? And that destabilizes my entire family. And am I ready to do that? Is my family ready to do that? So maybe that's a question I would say that individual needs to pray about it with their family and their closest friends to find out, is this a battle I need to take up today? I don't think I can give a better answer for that. It's 12 o'clock. I've been told we can keep going, but it is lunchtime. And you've been in here for 2 hours without a break. So I'm going to say, let's go get some lunch. And if you've got more questions, I'll be around for, chatting and such. So thank you, guys.
This presentation was made possible by the generous contributors to the Serious Joy Scholarship, permitting our graduates to launch into life and ministry without a burden of student loan debt.